This video is the second installment in my 9-day bike trip series riding across rural Ontario, Canada. In this segment I ride from Niagara Falls down to Rock Point Provincial Park, which is just outside of Dunnville, Ontario. So today is the 20th of May 2018 and I woke up this morning in my campsite at KOA Niagara Falls. I had a fair bit of trouble getting comfortable and falling asleep in my tent last night, so I ended up sleeping in until 9 a.m. But nevertheless I was all packed up and ready to ride to breakfast by about 10:15. Just down the road I stopped at the International House of Pancakes and I chose the cupcake and red velvet pancakes, which ended up making me more full than I really needed, but I had a long day of riding ahead of me. From there I continued east along Lundys Lane towards downtown Niagara Falls. It was a fairly grey and cloudy morning. This memorial marks the spot of one of the bloodiest battles of the War of 1812. I've now entered the downtown of Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls is full of all kinds of activities for tourists to participate in while they're visiting. But that certainly wasn't the kind of holiday that I had in mind for my trip. But I was, however, interested in the main attraction of Niagara Falls, the spectacular waterfalls. These are called the American Falls because the other side of the river is the United States. The Rainbow Bridge here is the border crossing that the bus uses when I've taken it to New York City. The larger waterfall in the distance is called Horseshoe Falls. And what a great opportunity for a selfie. You can also go ziplining at Niagara Falls if you want. Niagara Falls has a height of 51 meters and 2.4 million liters flow through it every second. The boat down there is called the Maid of the Mist. This is called Skylon Tower. There are lots of tall hotel buildings in Niagara Falls, which overlook the waterfalls. This is what it looks like overlooking the Horseshoe Falls from just upstream. Definitely not a place you'd want to go swimming. Just a little bit upstream from there you can see the Niagara Scow, which is a barge-style boat which is stuck on the bottom of the Niagara River. On August 6, 1918, there were 2 men aboard that boat when it was being towed by a tugboat and the line snapped. As the boat hurtled uncontrollably towards the waterfall, the men were able to release the false bottom of the boat and it got stuck on a rock shoal on the bottom of the river. 17 hours later, both men were safely rescued and brought back to shore. Almost 100 years later, the Niagara Scow still sits there in the same spot. After enjoying the sights of Niagara Falls, I continued following the Niagara River in the southeast direction towards Fort Erie. There's a multi-use bike path which follows the Niagara River all the way down, and it's right next to a scenic roadway known as the Niagara Parkway. Lots of beautiful scenery on one side, and some really large expensive homes on the other. And I even saw a cargo bike coming in the other direction. At some point along the way I switched from riding on the bike path to riding on the road instead because the pavement was a little bit smoother and the road was actually pretty quiet and the speed limit was only 60 kilometers per hour, so I felt pretty safe riding there. Compared to Niagara Falls a few kilometers downstream, I was really amazed at how calm the Niagara River was here. I'm now beginning to enter the town of Fort Erie. The bridge you see here is the International Railway Bridge. Built in 1873, it still carries trains across it every day between Canada and the United States. This is called the Peace Bridge, and it's a border crossing for cars and trucks linking together Fort Erie with Buffalo, New York. This is where the Niagara River opens up into Lake Erie, one of the 5 Great Lakes. This is the old British fort which the town of Fort Erie was named after. In the middle of the lake I spotted this interesting looking structure with a red pointed roof. This is the Buffalo Intake Crib, where the water supply is collected for the city of Buffalo. It was built in 1907 and also functions as a lighthouse. Those dark clouds are making me feel like rain might be on the way. Fort Erie is a nice looking sandy beach, although I didn't see anyone swimming today as the water in the lake is likely still quite cold. Here the bike path continues riding up next to a one-way street. Shortly afterwards I joined a paved rail path which goes all the way from Fort Erie to Port Colborne. Somewhere along the way a bunch of these black bugs got stuck to my shirt. This rail path is known as the Friendship Trail. I brought with me a small AM/FM radio, and this is my first time using it on the trip. I enjoy slowly spinning through the dial to see what radio stations I can pick up in a certain area. The trail passes through this small community of Ridgeway, which I stopped and had a quick look at. Unlike some rail trails, there's a fair bit of variety in the scenery along this one. I've now entered the city of Port Colborne, although the actual center of the city is quite a ways from here. It's neat that the Friendship Trail has its own restaurant stops along the way. While I was riding, I ran into two other cyclists who were doing a tour in the opposite direction as me on their bikes. We stopped and had a quick chat, and they told me that they had started in Dunnville that morning, and they were headed to Crystal Beach, just a few kilometers up the path. As I was pulling into Port Colborne, I spotted a Home Hardware, which I figured would be perfect because I was hoping to get some different bungee cords to use for strapping down my load. But unfortunately in Port Colborne, Home Hardware is not open on Sundays. This lift bridge was built in the 1920s, and it spans the Welland Canal. The Welland Canal provides safe passage for large ships to be able to get between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario by bypassing Niagara Falls. Port Colborne will be the last city or town that I'll pass through today before getting to my campground. It's around 3:15 p.m. now, so I decided to stop for a late lunch at Subway restaurant. I also stopped at Food Basics for some grocery items for dinner and went to Shoppers Drug Mart to try some different sunscreen. Even though I'd put on lots of sunscreen in the morning when I left my campsite and it had been a pretty cloudy day, I still noticed that my face was quite red when I stopped for lunch, so I wanted to try a different type of sunscreen instead. Beyond Port Colborne, the rail trail does continue for another 14 kilometers or so, but it's not a paved path. Instead, I decided to follow along the quiet roads, which follow the Lake Erie coast. On this part of the lake, most of the coastline is privately owned, so between the road and the water, there were lots of houses and cottages. After a long day of dark clouds, the sky had now turned blue, and it was quite sunny. Despite my earlier speculation, not a single raindrop fell on me today. Burnaby is the name of the community that I'm passing through now, and it's part of the township of Wainfleet, Ontario. In the distance, I spotted some wind turbines further inland. Please excuse the massive amounts of sunscreen on my face. There were very few vehicles along this road, and the ones that I did encounter gave me lots of space when they passed me. The speed limit was also never more than 60 kilometers per hour, which also made for a very enjoyable ride. I'm now entering the community of Lowbanks and also crossing into the county of Haldimand, leaving the Niagara region back behind me. It actually cooled off to around 10 degrees Celsius this afternoon, so as you can see I'm wearing my jacket here. Even though this roadway has a solid yellow line down the middle of it, almost every vehicle that passed me crossed all the way over to the other side when they passed me. Wind turbines were visible most of the way along the coast. The wind was fairly strong and coming from the west, which made for a headwind for the majority of my ride. And here I've arrived at the entrance to Rock Point Provincial Park. I stopped at the gatehouse to pick up my permit and then continued on to my campsite. When I arrived at my campsite, I was pretty disappointed with how muddy it was, but all the campsites there were the same, so there wasn't much I could really do. I carefully selected the least muddy spot and pitched my tent for the night. I then decided to go and check out the beach, which was just a short walk from my campsite. The beach was mostly made up of smooth pebbles, and the water looked nice and clear. Even though the air temperature and the water temperature were both pretty cold, I still felt that a swim in Lake Erie would be the perfect end to a day of riding. Despite living in Ontario practically my entire life, this is my first time ever swimming in Lake Erie, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. After my swim I got dried off and went and explored the coastline. Just below the water surface here there is a perfectly flat rock shelf. It was neat watching the waves roll in and pass over top of it. At first glance this beach surface looks like pebbles, but if you look more closely it's actually just a really big pile of small shells. Another very big pile of shells. Coming around the point I was able to see a portion of the coastline that I had ridden along earlier in the day. It's beautiful watching all the wind turbines spinning. The structure you see out there are the ruins of the Gull Island Lighthouse, which are located on Mohawk Island. The lighthouse was built in 1848 and decommissioned in 1969. Although my very muddy campsite had initially made me disappointed with my choice to stay at Rock Point, after I was able to get out and enjoy this beautiful scenery, I was certainly appreciative that I had decided to camp here. After rounding the point, I came inland and followed a pathway back to my campsite. I spotted this interesting camping setup on another campsite. As I approached my campsite, I saw something unusual sitting on the picnic bench. It looked like some kind of UFO had landed while I was away on my walk. It turned out it was a freshly popped batch of Jiffy Pop, a thoughtful gift from my neighbors in the next campsite. So my dinner tonight consisted of popcorn and some slices of the sugar pie that I bought in Port Colborne. Not exactly the most balanced meal, but I am on vacation. I decided to take my dessert down to the beach and eat it while enjoying the beautiful sunset. So on day 2 I traveled a total of approximately 97 kilometers on my bike, traveling from Niagara Falls to Rock Point Provincial Park. Stay tuned for part 3 of this 9-part series, where tomorrow I'll continue riding west along Lake Erie to another beautiful provincial park called Turkey Point.